We do research, and then we do the lobbying as well, and going and making our case to decision makers. And so, and again, that depending on who we're talking to, the message has to shift naturally in order to be convincing and to make our case. So that's me.
Hi, I'm Joshua Long. I'm an assistant professor of environmental studies at Southwestern University up in Georgetown. I've been doing research on Austin it's about 10 years now, and that's, I guess, what you would call my main research focus, but I'm sort of a 30,000 foot level person who looks at all of the different issues going on in Austin, whether they be economic, environmental, political, or how all these things really tie in together and affect one another. That tends to be how I look at the issues, which we often don't do enough of. We often see these issues as siloed, and yet they're extremely linked. I'm really excited to be here tonight because of the topic. My background is, I hope, perfect for this. I grew up on a ranch in Bastrop, Texas, born to an extremely conservative political family, and yet went off and got an education. And thank goodness for education. It helped me sort of broaden my mind beyond some of those issues. And so I'm often, very frequently in a position where I'm forced to talk to both sides of the issue and try to find some kind of resolution, something that is not always easy and seems to be getting a little bit more difficult in recent years. So I'm really excited to sort of explore some of the questions tonight that we'll be talking about. And talking to folks like these, I joked with Reed earlier that most of my writing and research is dependent on people like Susana, Brigid, and Luke, who I have interviewed for my stuff. So I actually am the secondary source of information for a lot of this stuff.
My name's Brigid Shea. I want to acknowledge Reed and Janice for pulling this together. I think this is a really important conversation to have in the community, and I'm really glad to hear you guys want to do this on a regular basis. I think this will really help us further the kind of dialogue that we need to have in the community. I came here in 1988 because of climate change, because of James Hansen's testimony to Congress. I left my job as a National Press Secretary in Washington, D.C. and came to Texas to help start the state chapter of Clean Water Action. And I did that for 3 years, and then had the privilege to help head up SOS, the Safer Springs Ordinance, which was where the citizens of Austin passed the strongest water quality ordinance in the nation by citizen initiative. And I think it's the reason we can still swim in Martin Springs today. It's our great David and Goliath story, and not enough people really know it. We should be telling it and telling our children and telling our children's children. It's a phenomenal story of what we as a community accomplished. I served on the city council, and I've worked on environmental initiatives since 1988, and I'm now a Travis County Commissioner, and I'm continuing to try and move the needle on climate change and on other environmental issues from that perspective. And so it requires that I deal with many different perspectives, and I think it's essential that we're able to do that, and so this is going to be a great conversation. Thanks.
Thank you, Reed, Janice, also for inviting me. I'm Susana Almanza, and I'm a native of East Austin, Texas. I was actually born here. And I've been working all my life on different issues, but 25 years ago, I was one of the co-founders of PODER, People Organized in Defense of Earth and Her Resources. Was the first environmental justice organization, the only one in Austin, but actually looking at environmental issues east of Highway I-35, which at that time was the Great Divide. And so our organization took on 6 of the largest oil companies in the world, and actually kicked their ass out of our communities. And we did it with $2,000 from a grant from Lois Gibb on Citizens House and Hazardous Waste. And then we took on the second biggest, largest waste management corporation, BFI. And also, that campaign was a little longer, but we were able to get them out. And then we took on the city with the Holly Power Plant. And that process took about 10 years, even though other community members had been working on it about 10 years before that. And so we were instrumental. And then we took on the whole issue of land use and zoning, and were able to rezone over 600 properties that were zoned industrial and commercial and were non-compatible to residential areas in the community. And we filed one of the first Title VI complaints in the whole United States. We were one of the top 11 people to use the Title VI complaint for civil rights, looking at the actions that the city was doing, and also looking at the whole issue of the toll roads. And so, yeah, and actually participated in the first Environmental Justice Summit of People of Color in Washington, D.C. in 1991, and was one of the co-authors of the Principles of Environmental Justice that we have today. And so I really look forward to being here and speaking on whatever the issues are.
All right, great. Thank you, everybody. As you can see, we have both breadth and depth of experience and a lot to draw on here. And so we have some questions, like I said, but when we talked just kind of as a group here before the event, we kind of decided that it would be good to kick it off with a real general kind of your overall perspective on the climate in Texas or the place of environmental politics in Texas. Is that a safe way to kick it off and leave it broad enough for you guys? So we're going to do one other quick round then with just your kind of perspective, just to give everyone a little bit of overview on where you guys come from as individuals, and then maybe they'll have some clue as to where to direct their questions as we get into it.
Great. So clearly Texas has some incredibly profound environmental problems, whether it's climate change and the extreme weather, whether it's flooding in Wimberley or Houston, or rising sea levels or extreme heat, as well as more the conventional pollutants, whether it's air pollution, refineries along the Gulf Coast, especially in kind of low-income minority communities, or just huge problems with water, both during drought and without drought. So clearly we have huge problems, and our approach is we use a couple different kind of organizing strategies. We're about winning results. We want to get the pollution out of the air, out of the water. We want to protect our parks. We want to improve public health. And so towards those goals, we have kind of a few different organizing approaches, and one of which is we have no permanent friends, no permanent enemies. We want to work with whoever will work with us in order to accomplish a goal. And so that means that we are sometimes working with kind of unlikely allies, whether it's conservatives or more progressive organizations, labor unions, and really working across the divide. And then the other, I think, organizing approach is the one that Saul Alinsky, the famous community organizer, espoused, which is organize people where they're at. So recognizing not everyone, understands the urgency of the climate crisis, and you have to figure out, what are they concerned with, and how do you slowly engage them and move them along. And so again, so those are kind of the principles. And so then I think it's important to step back and look at where are the people at in Texas, and clearly it's not just one monolith that everyone's in the same place. We have a very diverse state. We have both some of our cities like Austin, very progressive, have long been leaders on environmental protection. We're also then seeing other cities as well, San Antonio, which is competing with us on solar power, or Houston, which is the largest municipal purchaser of renewable energy in the country, or Dallas, where the mayor have been outspoken in support of climate action. So we have both the cities where there's a lot of great things happening, and then we have the Texas legislature. Sorry. And which is, I think, is different. It's more challenging, and it wasn't always so. I pointed to Senator Averett there, who in about, I guess, 6 years before that, was the chair of the Senate Natural Resources Committee, and was part of a cadre of moderate Republicans in the legislature who were actually doing really good things for the environment, who helped pass one of the first renewable energy mandates in the country, who helped establish a funding program to clean up dirty diesel trucks, and helped fund water conservation in parks. So we're doing a lot of great things. And then I think in 2010, with kind of the Tea Party wave, we started to see a kind of a shift in the legislature. We've since lost great people like Senator Averett and Senator Corona and others, moderate, who I think were reasonable people who wanted to just find solutions, who weren't so concerned about partisanship. And we're losing a lot of those people in the legislature. And I think then if you just kind of step back also, if you look at just the demographics, of course, we have all the talk of, it's this year Texas is finally going to be a purple state, and we're finally going to elect Wendy Davis. And and I think that hope is still out there. The Houston Chronicle did an analysis, and they project that Texas will probably be a purple state by in the year 2024. So it's on the horizon. It's still there, but it's a ways off still. And so I think it's important to just recognize that then. And so then you have the question of, okay, what do we do? Do we just, we just work with conservatives and try and, figure out what common ground there is, or do we just organize our base? We just organize liberals and build power until that 2024, and then we can sweep, government and impose our environmental agenda. Or is it some combination, or do you just focus on the cities? Because we do have opportunities there, and the cities actually have, especially ones that own their electric utilities like Austin, can do really great things at the city level. And so I think all those things then help you decide, to what extent, you care about this, And so I think if you're organizing at the Austin City Council, there are, 2 to 3 kind of conservative votes on there, but then you have another 8, or more reliably progressive, not always. So then you would say, well, do I even need to bother organizing conservatives? Is that even a good use of my time? But then again, if you're working in the legislature, where it's heavily dominated by conservatives, you do have to kind of consider that more and figure out, where can I find alliances? Where is that common ground? And I don't know the answer. We really struggle with that. In terms of how much it's worth it to engage at the state level, because we do have, unfortunately, that heyday of kind of moderate Republicans doing some really good environmental policy is mostly over. Instead, we've got Governor Abbott, who as Attorney General sued the EPA proudly, I think 25 times, and said his job is, I come to the office, I sue Obama, and then I go home. And the EPA doing some really good progressive environmental policy, that's a tough position to be in. And then you have, state agencies like the Railroad Commission, who get elected with millions of dollars in campaign contributions by the very industry that they're responsible for regulating. You have to wonder, do you even have, is it even worth it to kind of engage that? And we go back and forth on that in terms of, whether it's worth it. I think we have to engage again. It's still 8 years off before maybe we've got a chance to put some more reasonable people in power, and so we have to engage at that level. So I guess I'll stop there and say, thanks.
Wow, so that gave me a lot because Luke covered everything, and I'm going to echo most of what he said and build upon what he was saying, where you have to meet people where they're at. A lot of it has to do with communication and the language you use, and so you're reminding me that when you're talking about some of these issues, like for instance, say you're talking to somebody who's a very strong Tea Party conservative, we have to talk about being conservative in our budget, and that's a great way to talk about things like energy efficiency. If you're talking about ranchers and private landowners, you can start to talk to them about stewardship, which is a language that is used. And actually harpers back to a lot of Christian principles that I think that a lot of people in Texas hold on to. Like, they want to hear the term stewardship because it's something that came from their background. And you also want to introduce them to things like incentives and programs that benefit them. When you tell somebody, oh, you've got an endangered species on their property, their immediate reaction is to push back. Well, the first thing you should be saying is think about all of these different programs through Environmental Defense Fund, Nature Conservancy, and Texas Parks and Wildlife that will provide you funding that will actually increase your output and make your ranch or whatever operation you have more sustainable. I remember speaking to cotton farmers in the panhandle of Texas, and they do not like the restrictions on water pumping for irrigation. And I said, well, you've been farming, according to you, for 50 years. What have you seen in terms of water pressure and water output coming from the Ogallala since that time? And they talk about how much it's been declining. How much longer do you think that is? And I think it's important to sort of put those regulations in place so that we can maintain some kind of farming principles. And so that's hard to do as an environmentalist, especially when you're idealistic, which I tend to be. And you kind of have to take off your idealist hat and put on a political realist hat and find a way to communicate and use some of these languages and principles. And I can think of about another dozen issues.
This is
I'll
a
pass
good
on.
opening. Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the things that I will come back to later is I think we need to start talking about not only sort of rural issues, which are still extremely important in Texas, but what you brought up was urban issues. Some of the fastest growing cities in the United States are right here in Texas, and they introduce some very specific and unique issues, especially for the state of Texas, where we can actually have a huge impact, certainly with climate, but also with transportation, water, and some of the issues we're avoiding, like environmental justice, housing affordability, things like that, where there are a great deal of crossover with other issues.
A lot of it, I think, is personal. It's sort of how we interact with people. I came here in 1988 literally to work on climate change issues, and in the time I've been working on it, since 1988, it's become a taboo subject in the state of Texas. I mean, literally under Rick Perry, there was an edict that went out that basically said to state employees, you cannot use this term in any state reports. And he made scientists and people overseeing studies that had come from scientists go back and remove that language from the reports. So I think we've swung really far in the opposite direction if in this country in particular we're now censoring our scientists. But it's also, I think, because there's so much money involved, and the fossil fuel companies, which are probably some of the wealthiest companies on the planet, are truly threatened by the implications of what needs to be done around climate. And so I despaired for a number of years that it was even possible to talk with people about it, to even have a conversation where they could hear what you had to say. And for a long time, two things happened. One is I did some consulting work with a company I started with a fellow named Terry Moore, and we called ourselves Carbon Shrinks. And our focus was on companies that were large carbon emitters, greenhouse gas emitters. And the first one we targeted was a cement plant in Buda, Texas Lehigh Cement. Cement is one of the most intense carbon-producing industries. They literally melt calcium carbonate, limestone. So they release the carbon from that process, and they burn a ton of coal to get the heat high enough to melt rock. So there's a lot of carbon released from the burning of coal. And we reached out to them in, it was 2007 or 2000, it was 2008, because Obama and McCain were both running, and both of them were clearly in favor of some kind of cap and trade, some kind of legislation to limit carbon emissions, and they were thinking that a market mechanism was a good one. And so the guys in the cement industry were thinking, man, whoever wins, we're going to be looking at some kind of regulation that we've got to deal with on carbon emissions. And so we reached out to them with a query and a kind of a proposal to work with them on a strategic plan to reduce their carbon emissions. And the really interesting thing was they knew of me, and their first response was they thought I was trying to get inside so I could spy on their plant and do something nefarious, I guess, as an environmentalist. And so in the first meeting that we had with them, all the body language around the tables was really kind of weird and interesting, because they were thinking that I was literally trying to be some kind of industrial spy. And I think they were so shocked that we sounded reasonable, and we actually had a proposal to work with them on something that would be useful. We ended up working with them, and the project that we did won a TCEQ Environmental Excellence Award for them. So that was a really interesting experience, because partway into the project, the head of the cement plant pulled me aside before a meeting that we had with a bunch of the Sierra Club leadership, including Neil Carman, who's a real air quality expert. And he said, I gotta tell you, I don't really even believe in this climate change crap, but I know there's some, legislation that's gonna probably affect us, so we figure we have to do something. And I said, I don't really care how you got here, But the fact that you are looking at this practically and thinking you're going to have to deal with some regulation, and what that told me was that economics is such a huge part of it, and they were really just looking at what impact it would have on their business. They didn't care about any of the other stuff, and frankly, a number of them probably didn't even believe that climate change was actually happening. So that's just a really crucial thing to understand, and it really does go back to what Luke was saying about, take people where they're at. And I'll tell the story later.
Yeah, I think that definitely climate change is one of the major crises that's impacting us, and more people of color, because early in the 90s when we did a report, Toxicity in Texas and Impact on People of Color, we found that most of all of the industrial sites were communities of color. And even today, where you see who's impacted by the coal mining, just looking at the case that came up with TCEQ, Los Dos Repúblicas, the coal mining, and how that's impacting, their whole portable water. And so when we look at this, I think that one of the things that we're missing is how do we talk to the common everyday people so that they can apply the pressure on their political representatives, instead of just trying directly to go to talk to them and get them to change their view. I think that it takes educating and informing the general population about that, and there's a lot of common things that we have. We have in common, one thing, we have air, that's very much in common, and the other thing is that we have water that's very much in common, and land, that's a universal common thing that we all have, is we all want to be breathing clean air and drinking clean water and being able to live off the land. So that's all very much important to us, but I think that we lack a lot of work in working with one another in a diverse way to inform and educate and bring everybody up to the same level, and to be able to transcend the different languages and communications with the people, so that they become empowered. Because I can tell you that all these cities that were just named, most all of them endured flooding, and even here in Austin. The flooding had been devastating throughout the whole state of Texas and what's happening to people. That's a big issue. The other big issue is fire. Fire is something that people really understand, and that has been impacting so many communities. And that's all our understanding of climate change. And then when we look at health, health is a very common denominator. People understand health. And when you can relate to them that the certain diseases that are coming or that you're undergoing is due to climate change, that really wakes them up. You do all the air numbers and stats, but if you have to really be about reality, health is something that everybody understands. Cancer is something that everybody understands also, because nowadays I can ask an audience how many people here have a family member that has cancer or know of someone that has cancer, and I can tell you there's practically no one that will not raise their hand, because it's so real. Those are real issues. And so I think that the real empowerment has to come at the grassroots level, whether it's low income, whether it's middle income, or upper income, is how do we make sure to involve them in the process so that they then can inform their elected officials about what's really happening. Because I don't see a lot of change, because due to the gerrymandering, how long will it take before people who might have one mindset about they're more important looking at dollars than they are looking about what's happening to human life or the environment. And I think that those are the big things that we're challenging. The big challenge that we're taking on, as usual, has always been money. Has always been money and greed and individualism. And so when we look at that, we have to go back to a lot of our indigenous communities and look at the whole use, go even further and look at tribal councils and look at our elders and youth and the road that they take, and how do we make sure that we don't exclude those thoughts, because it's been the elders that have been telling us, the environment is being messed up, and the climate is being messed up, and even, our parents, we're saying now we don't even know the seasons, the planting season, or no longer the way they used to be. As we were growing up, a lot of people get surprised, but we were really the first urban farmers, because we lived right in the city on 10th and Lydia. And so I know a lot of the younger population think it's a new thing and they just discovered it. But I have to tell, press their bubble and said, no, you didn't discover it. Guess what? I was in the urban core. I can tell you, all my neighbors, we had urban farms. It's not a new thing. And guess what? Walkable cities is not a new thing either. We've been walking all our lives. My family never owned a vehicle, and I can tell you most of the people we knew didn't own vehicles. So sorry to tell you, but walkable cities is not a new thing, at least not for people of color. It's always been around. So I just think that those are a lot of common things that we need to empower. How do we empower those communities to make sure they put on the pressure?
Well, thanks for that opening round. Hopefully it gives everyone a little context to where everyone here comes from. What I was going to turn to next, which is something that you guys have really already kind of touched on, is that I think understanding the historical context of Texas as a conservative state and some of the things that go along with that is helpful in understanding how to connect with the powers that be and people that may have conflicting priorities with environmental causes being top of their list. I know that land rights, energy production, the entrepreneurial nature of the state, these are things that have are part of the makeup of the culture of Texas, and that things like regulations and shifts from traditional or maybe comfortable practices in how they've done things in Texas or how we've done things in Texas is tough stuff to overcome in some case. So I want to ask you guys, what's your perspective on how do we align those priorities, those increasingly urgent priorities with the history of Texas? It's not just by coincidence that Texas is a conservative state, there's history there. And how do we, is it a matter of the language that we speak? I know that in the case of talking, there have been times when I've noticed that talking to someone with a more conservative mindset, using the word conservation as opposed to environmentalism is a simple tweak that sometimes has a different connecting point. Who would like to respond to that kind of general question first? Anybody? Or is it too general?
I could buy.
Yeah, okay.
Well, I think it's important to recognize that conservative doesn't mean necessarily anti-environment. That Texans, if you look at the polls, majorities support cleaner air and support cleaner water and full funding for our parks and water conservation and even action on global warming. So I think that in most cases, most Texans, even Republicans, even self-identified conservatives, are with us on a lot of these core issues. I think there's a breakdown when some of it comes to some of the partisan things. So when you say it's President Obama and the EPA that's doing these things, you'll lose a set of people. But I think it's important to recognize, at least on just the core principles and beliefs, that the people are with us. And I think then the partisanship definitely breaks it down, and then the money also breaks it down. The huge money that's spent by the fossil fuel industry, for example, to deny the science of climate change, or to fund inaction, or to fund the legislators who won't act on those kinds of issues. But that's, again, separate then from where the people are at. So I think it's just important to kind of recognize those things. And then I think that, though, still within that, because of the money, it makes it a lot harder to win, say, on global warming in Texas. And so we have, one of the strategies we've done is then to kind of pick out issues where we think we can have some, common cause. And so things like parks funding, where, we have some beautiful parks, everything from, Potter Island to Big Bend, but historically they've been underfunded. Even though we have a sales tax on sporting goods that's supposed to go to our parks, the legislature routinely raided that money and used it for other things. And so, but in terms of like ideology, we didn't really have any disagreement on no, in fact, our parks should be funded. And so, we were together with a pretty broad, diverse coalition of, both environmentalists, conservationists, recreationists, hunters, fishermen, recreational businesses, and others who for years have been advocating for this funding. And finally, first in 2007 we saw a huge increase in funding by the legislature, and then again this past session finally had some restoration of the funding and some clear dedication of that sporting goods sales tax to our parks. So that's kind of one area of common ground. Water rights, and this is something that doesn't break down on an ideological perspective, but often it breaks down more of the rural-urban kind of split, where you see things like people in northeast Texas around the Marvin Nichols Reservoir, the proposed reservoir, are fighting people in Dallas over the water. And so that makes some interesting alliances where you've got conservative landowners, you've got timber companies, you've got Tea Party legislators like Representative David Simpson, and environmental groups like the Sierra Club and Environment Texas all coming together to say, no, you can't wipe out 25,000 acres of rare forest land that's home to important wildlife, and it's a source of timber for the timber industry, blah, blah. And us challenging kind of some of the urban Dallas interests, which include sometimes some of our progressive allies and some of our Democratic friends. And so it doesn't always break down on that one. And I think the same is true then you'll see with like eminent domain, where you've got like an energy company, whether it's TransCanada building the Keystone Pipeline or the Big Bend Pipeline, big powerful energy interests coming up against sometimes powerful landowners. And unfortunately, those two examples, they don't have a happy ending, but at least you're seeing those kind of different kind of fights. It's not always kind of liberal versus conservative.
Just briefly, I would follow up on that and say that there's a good news, bad news situation. And I think the good news is that the urban political culture of Texas is changing. Our cities are growing fast, they're becoming more diverse, and we're starting to see a support for issues that we hadn't seen in the past, especially with climate protection, but also transportation issues, water issues as well. And so there is good news on that front in a lot of different ways. Rural culture in Texas is very much like it has been for a very long time. And so you have to look at some of the different ways that you can reach out to those groups. And we've talked about some of them. Some state agencies have been extremely effective at doing that, especially Texas Parks and Wildlife. I'm a big fan of Texas Parks and Wildlife. Other agencies, less so. But you kind of have to, again, it goes back to talking about where you meet people at their level with their interests and finding ways to communicate on those. But I do want to come back later to that urban question, and I don't want to hijack it.
Well, so is urban versus rural part of the story in where the legislature is at? I mean, is the legislature unduly influenced in your view by urban or by rural population versus urban?
It's a big state. And a lot of representation comes from rural areas, and also some of the biggest environmental issues are influenced by, think about this. We forget that Texas is one of the most biodiverse states in the United States. And what are some of the issues that affect our biodiversity the most? Things like agriculture. These are huge swaths of land that are often represented in very conservative districts. And so it's hard to communicate. And of course, they're going to push back, and rightfully so, and say, this is a huge economic impact in the state of Texas, is our agriculture. And so you see this sort of tension occurring, and I think when I said good news, bad news, I don't see a lot of good news because if you talk to folks out in Midland, Odessa, or Lubbock area, they talk about Austin like a lot of people will talk about DC. They'll think Austin is sort of influence. And I think you can probably back me up on that. Is that Austin is seen as this almost like a federal capital of Texas that's influencing them. So yeah, that will be a challenge for sure.
Yeah, and I hope we'll get to questions because we really have an expert here in Senator Brigid. I do think that a lot of what Susana was saying about the things that we share in common. Increasingly, I find that people are worried about water in Texas, and they should be. We're running out. The dry line is, it rains so everybody forgets. The dry line is moving further and further east. And when the lakes were really low and we were on limited watering, people were much more conscious of it. But I think in general, there's this like nagging awareness in the back of people's minds about water. After Bastrop, I think that changed everybody's thinking about wildfire. And that was part of my own kind of personal story. For a long time, I just thought, we're never going to make progress in climate change. We're up against this unlimited amount of money on the other side that has a huge vested interest in, not allowing progress, or what I would view as progress, on climate change, because it, affects them so dramatically, so much in their pocketbook, which is the fossil fuel lobby. But I had a kind of an epiphany around the whole notion of community preparedness. I used to think that was like waving the white flag of defeat, like admitting can't do anything about it, we all just need to build bunkers and pack it with MREs and get in and wait for the end. And a few years back, because I have children, I started to realize we actually have an obligation as civic leaders to do whatever we can to try and prepare people. Because we don't have enough firefighters, we don't have enough first responders to rescue everybody. And so people have to be better prepared and know what to do in the case of a flood or a wildfire or a tornado or even a drought. And so that for me was a huge shift, and I've found over and over again, even the most ardent climate denier, if you say to them, do you think your community leaders should do what they can within reason to try and protect the population from floods and wildfires and tornadoes and weather disasters, they'll all say yes. And so that's a place of common ground. And I think it's important for communities to begin to try and really look at what it will take, what kind of steps are involved, and also what it'll cost. Because then maybe they'll start to ask the question, really? It's going to cost us that much money? Well, what caused this? Or who was involved in causing it? And I think that's part of a very important larger conversation that has to happen. But there is broad agreement, I'd say, that we should do everything we can within reason, within limits, to try and better prepare our communities.
And to back that up, just the percentage increase of budgets going to flood mitigation, hazards, firefighting is increasing, and that's not something projected in the future. You can say, like, look at the last 15 years, and people understand the language of money.
I just got to diddle what everybody else said here, because it's right on exactly as I sit here and think about it. I've been working with various communities and really haven't been involved with the Texas legislature, so I can't talk much about that, and I've kind of stayed away from it. I really don't. I really don't even want to be there, because you just sit there and you invest all your time, and so. Since I'm a lot older, I'm real particular about my time and where I'm gonna invest my time. When I was young, I didn't mind all-night meetings and all that, and I'm just going like, hey, been there, done that, not gonna do it again. So I'll let the next generation be working on that. So I think that as we grow and we mature, we began to think about a lot of different things and how we want to invest our time. Whether somebody is conservative or liberal or independent or in the middle or whatever they want to, however they see themselves or define themselves. But I'm always taken aback, because I think that the bigger thing should be human rights, that the bigger issue that we should be addressing at the national and international level is human rights, because our right to water and clean water, safe water, is a human right, and our right to air and to the land. Those are all part of human rights, and that should be superseding whatever the state legislature does or whatever the federal government does. Is that how do we begin to look at the issues that are so important as human rights? And I think that would be the superseding cause of how we take care of our environment and how do we take care of humanity and how we bring that balance between humanity and the environment. That's been forever, because I tell young people, it wasn't that long ago that we could drink water from the streams and the creek, and they just think impossible. You mean that existed? And so, yeah, you could play in all the different creeks and waters here in Austin, because that's all we did all summer long, was explore all the creeks in Austin. And guess what? We didn't get bacteria, and we didn't get sick, and all of these other things. And there was water. You know, there was water in a lot of creeks that you just see it trickle now. And so, you know, those things that we have to remind people, the devastation that has happened, you know, because of the industrialization and how we now value money more than we value the environment and humanity. And so I think that we need to continue to look at it as a human rights issue.